All right, Monarchs, welcome to the second video for lesson 3.6, solving absolute value equations. If you have not watched the first video, please go back and do that now because this is the second video. Okay, before we can set up our two separate equations, we need to isolate our absolute value. So right now there's a 2 outside of our absolute value, and that 2 is multiplying our absolute value. So anytime there's something outside of our absolute value bars, and we'll see that down here too, we have to move it before we can set up our two separate equations. Okay, so before we can set up our two numbers, our two separate equations, we have to get rid of this 2. I know that this 2 is multiplying my absolute value, so to move it, I have to do division. So I'm going to divide by 2 and divide by 2. So those cancel out, and I'm left with the absolute value of x equals 3. Okay, so now since I don't have anything that is with my absolute value, now I just split it up into two separate x equals 3, and my other could be x equals negative 3. Okay, so here I'm just going to put x equals 3 or x equals negative 3. And that's because the absolute value of x, there are two different numbers where the absolute value would be 3. We could plug in a negative 3 for x, and my absolute value would still be 3. We could also plug in a 3 for x, and my absolute value would still be 3, because both of these numbers have a distance of 3 from 0. Okay, so for when I graph these now, I go to negative 3, do a closed dot above negative 3, and I go to 3 and do a closed dot above 3. And it's a closed dot because it has this equals sign. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on to example 3. All right, we're going to move on to example 3. Example 3 says to solve the absolute value of 3x minus 7 plus 5 equals 9. And it says to isolate the absolute value expression on one side of the equation. So that's kind of what we did up here too. Right now, up here, the absolute value equation was not isolated because this 2 is multiplying. Okay, so we had to divide by that 2 before we could split it into two separate numbers. Same with here, our absolute value equation is not isolated because there's this plus 5. Okay, so we need to move this plus 5 to the other side of the equal sign in order to get our absolute value equation by itself. So we know that to move something across the equal sign, we have to do the opposite. So I'm going to do the opposite of plus 5, which would be a minus 5. Okay, so these cancel out. 9 minus 5 would be 4. Okay, and then I just move my 3x minus 7 down. So my new equation is now the absolute value of 3x minus 7 equals 4. Since there's nothing that's on the same side of the equal sign as my absolute value, I can now split this into two separate equations. Okay, so when I split it into two separate equations, that's when I make my answer positive and negative. So first I'll have 3x minus 7 equals 4. I'll also have 3x minus 7 equals negative 4. Okay, so now is when I would solve this. All right, now is when I would solve this. So I'm going to highlight some things before we do that. Remember, we always set up two equations. Okay, we set up two equations. We set up one positive and one negative. So that's what I'm going to write. One positive and one negative. And that's exactly what we did. See, one negative here, one positive here. All right, so when we solve these, it's just like any other equation that we would normally solve. I'm going to draw my arrows straight down. This minus 7 is on the same side as my 3x right now, so I know that I need to move that. So I have to add 7 to both sides. Okay. So negative 7 plus 7 is 0. I'm left with 3x equals, and 4 plus 7 would be 11. Okay. Then I would divide by 3, and I would get x equals, those cancel out. Let me put this on my calculator because this is going to be a decimal. So I do 11 divided by 3, and that is 3.66 repeating. So I'm going to round that to 3.67. Okay, so x equals 3.67, or let's solve this one now. So we would add 7. We'd add 7. Okay. So those cancel out. I'm left with 3x equals negative 4 plus 7 is 3. So I divide by 3 and divide by 3, and I would get x equals 1. Okay, so my two answers would be x equals 3.67 or x equals 1. So remember, we isolated our absolute value equation. So we had to move this plus 5 before we could split our equation up into two equations. So before we could split our absolute value up into two equations, rather, we split it up into a positive and a negative, and then we solved both of those two equations. Okay, so go ahead and stay tuned for the next video. We will do the next two examples.